Trial of the Century was a Minecraft Machinima short that kind of became a lot more than we originally bargained for as the production went along.
And I just thought to myself, oh, I'm gonna take this up as a job and I'm gonna nail it.
Every bit of that court is what a real court would look like.
Originally, the Trial of the Century was just supposed to be the first in a series of standalone anthology-style Minecraft one-shot machinimas that we were making after the Edenith Chronicle. Now, eventually that idea as a whole kind of got scrapped, but we did still want to finish the Trial of the Century since that was one in that series that we had begun work on. And so my inspiration for this particular short was kind of looking at the works of Aaron Sorkin, who's one of my favorite screenwriters. And I've always kind of liked what he does with legal and political dramas, and specifically the way he takes the jargon of those fields and sort of orchestrates it into such beautiful dialogue. But yeah, so I wanted to kind of capture some of that essence in taking legal drama and attempting to use the Minecraft medium to represent that. So one thing that was important to us was making sure that even though it's in Minecraft, even though it's liable to not be taken very seriously, it was important to us that we took it seriously as a courtroom drama. And we wanted to make sure we had a viable sort of facsimile of a courtroom and had something that was presented very much like an American courtroom. And so that involved a lot of front-end research that we were very heavy on, both for the visual aesthetic and also for the writing end of making it presented in such a way that it is believable and follows procedures that people in the legal field would be able to recognize.
The interiors actually had to do so much research on what interior courthouses look like and what every individual part of the courthouse, like its purpose and its like positioning in the room, depending on the courthouse and the size of the courthouse, and I was, trying to figure out where all that went, was more just tons of research and just trying to figure out what worked with the actual space that I had given myself. Every single bit of that courthouse is pretty much directly taken from some court reference that I found online. All of it was very carefully researched and very carefully planned out. Yeah, every bit of that court is what a real court would look like.
So again, we started pre-production back in 2017, kind of riding right off the end of post-production for the Edenith Chronicle, and we took a lot of the people that we'd worked with on Edenith and sort of reduced our crew down to a handful of trusted individuals who basically contributed to working on the building process on this short, as well as developing and designing the skins. Our artist, Emmy, actually designed all of the skins for the principal cast in this particular short, and I think did a phenomenal job of it, and worked with Loryn to sort of find the look and dial it down to what it was going to be.
And a lot of that was trying to find the right color palettes to go with the characters and trying to figure out what kind of facial features matched with that mob template. So there was a couple of characters who we had several versions of like just eye placement, or just like which version best fits this kind of a character, and then we'd have like 3 or 4 to choose from, like, oh, this one definitely works, this one doesn't work as much, maybe we can go a little bit more in this direction or whatever. Just trying to make sure that their skins matched their mob counterpart without looking too much like the mob. Just kind of invoking the feeling of it. And I think we put more work into these individual skins than we did with Edenith, because there was more skins with Edenith, so we just kind of had to get them done. But since there was only 4, we got a little extra time to just kind of focus on each one and more individually.
So there were essentially only a couple of major sets. There was the exterior of the courthouse, which was designed around this singular camera angle that we were going to use for the establishing shot. And then there was also the courthouse interior, which was going to be shot from all sorts of angles, and it was essentially going to be the main set where a majority of the scenes take place. And then, of course, there was the road and the farmhouse and those sorts of sets, and those were actually created much later during production. Those I pretty much made entirely on my own, as they were kind of minor sets, but the cityscape was the primary thing that we wanted to have all hands on deck for, to have a lot of great builders contributing to making that area look as great as it could possibly be.
if I remember correctly, the only decisions I had going into it, I think, were it was not a small town, but it was not a large city. And it was somewhere between kind of like updated modern with classic older architecture. There were like these glass skyscrapers and all that in the background, but then the primary building was an older kind of legacy building that would have been, kept up and reused throughout the ages. And I think that was the primary direction I had with the actual courthouse and with the exteriors. Yeah, so a lot of it was just trying to search for the styles of the buildings that were going to surround the courthouse. The establishing angle was, I believe that was the one thing, the one angle that we knew was going to have an exterior shot. So we actually had the entire city was laid out just for that one angle. So if there were any buildings that were to be built, we had to place them just for that one view, which made it very easy because buildings could be half built if they're only partially shown. Just to get the idea of the layout of where all the buildings were going to be, we did make a little bit of a mini kind of city block layout where I could show all the builders. This is the main building. These are all the buildings that need to be built and the positions they need to be built in. That way we didn't have anybody building buildings or have anything just that was kind of out of the way and we weren't sure if it was going to be shown. That way everybody knew what the boundaries were of where we could start building.
And so with the sets built and the skins designed, we were shooting to go into production, but because this revolves so heavily around the fast-paced dialogue, I wanted to do something that I didn't do for Edenith, which is have all of the voiceover recorded and edited first before I start shooting the scenes. That way I could shoot the scenes synced to the finished voiceover, and that way the cut of the dialogue and the pacing of it dictates the pacing of the scene itself, instead of shooting the machinimation and then trying to make it work in post, which was essentially what we were doing for most of Edenith. I didn't want to have that, and I wanted to have a much finer control over the pacing, and so we started with voiceover this time. But the only issue was we had trouble casting the role of Jessica Blaze, as the dialogue was very particular, it was very technical and very fast-paced, and we wanted to make sure we had somebody who can sort of meet that challenge, and unfortunately we weren't able to find anybody in that initial wave of production. So we recorded voiceover for pretty much all of the rest of the cast back then in 2017, as well as going into 2018 a bit, but then we got sidetracked by other projects, such as Resin Roleplay, and eventually the production just kind of halted and fell by the wayside wholesale. But then fast forward a couple of years to 2020, and we are approaching a time when we are basically looking to be moving forward, and I figured before we go into that, I want to make sure I have loose ends tied though, and I want to make sure this short gets done, which we committed to doing all those years prior. And so we made an effort to sort of resurrect the project. And the first thing, of course, that we had to do was cast Jessica Blaze. And fortuitously, I had just worked with Scuffle for the first time on a separate production. I was an actor in the Shattered Crown film, The Golden Sword of Pircania, and through that I got to meet Scuffle, who's been a bit of a rising star in the Machinima community. And seeing as she was a bit of a recognizable name, and I'd seen firsthand her talents in Rebecca Lethane, I figured she might be the perfect person to take on the job, and so I reached out to her and gave her the sort of pitch, and she emphatically jumped on board and took on the challenge.
Jessica is the prosecutor, so she's kind of the attacking side, I guess, on the trial. And, there's the suspect that she's asking questions and stuff like that, and she might seem a little bit smug sometimes, but I think she's very confident about herself in this whole case.
I have no further questions.
So I think I just kind of decided, like, oh, well, what does a good prosecutor sound like in my mind? And I'm like, well, she should sound professional and serious, because obviously you're not gonna, be joking around in a courtroom. Like, I asked a few questions about her as well, and I kind of got to know how she prepared herself, like she knew what she was talking about. So confident and stuff like that I kind of took with me in the recording.
And she knocked it out of the ballpark. Any worry I had about casting that role was quickly dispelled by her acting abilities. Even given all of the jargon and all of the technical language that she had to learn, especially given that English isn't her first language, was mighty impressive to see the performance that she put on for it.
Yeah, honestly, I've come pretty far with as far as the English language goes for me, but yeah, I did have some words that I kind of stumbled over. It's because I haven't really heard any of those words. I don't work in that type of sector or anything, so yeah, I'm just kind of saying words which I don't really know what they mean exactly, but you just kind of need to, oh, well, if you don't know a word, then just ask, and then you'll know what you're talking about. Well, some things that I really enjoyed about it was also kind of the challenge, because when you reached out to me, it was kind of like, yeah, so I have this role and I'm having trouble finding somebody for it, and I just thought to myself, oh, I'm gonna take this up as a job and I'm gonna nail it. Maybe not a lot of people dare to do it, and I'm just like, well, I'm just gonna take it and do it, because the more experiences, the better I get, I think. So, and when I saw the role, I was like, well, I've done maybe some villains and some minor characters or some smaller, and lately I've been trying to pick up a lot of different things, so I was really glad when this came.
So after that long several year period of production hell, and after finally casting Jessica Blaze, we were able to finish the voiceovers, and we actually redid some of them. We redid Danny Gidlow, and I redid my lines for Curt, just because I knew we had both grown so much as actors since then, and so we wanted to make sure we had the latest and greatest.
The character I play is Danny Gidlow, and Danny Gidlow is the primary witness in the case against Joe Pigman. I recorded all of his lines, cut to a few months ago when we decided to pick it back up again, and I wanted to redo all of my lines as that character. It was kind of interesting going back to a character that I had played before, and I tried to make new decisions, but I think there was some parallels between the original acting that I did and the acting I did immediately prior to the actual filming of it. I knew he was a little bit of an older gentleman and kind of like a rural person, so I gave him a southern kind of gravelly working man's kind of thing. Like, he's used to using his voice as a tool like everything else that he would have around his place, so I gave him a little bit of a gravel, a little bit of a southern accent.
So normally I don't consider myself much of an actor, but in recent years I've actually had a lot of sort of acting experiences that have helped me to develop more in that area. And so I actually felt pretty confident stepping into the lead role for this one, especially given some of the more difficult language in the dialogue. I knew that I would be capable of handling that with my articulation and my public speaking background. And so I play Curt Enderman, who is the main defense attorney for Joe Pigman, who's been accused of a heinous crime. Curt, however, is in an interesting moral dilemma insofar as he's obligated to defend his client. However, he doesn't believe that his client is entirely innocent, and that feeling sort of festers and grows as the story goes on. And so he has a bit of an arc there. He has to figure out, okay, how am I going to go about this? What am I going to do about that?
Doing Daniel was fun. I think you had me do a couple of lines over again, because in the edit there was a couple lines that didn't quite match with the tempo of the edit, so you had me redo one or two lines. As night had been falling, a strange light caught my eye.
But other than that, the performances from the rest of the cast that we recorded several years prior very much sufficed. So we stuck with those and went ahead and I went through and I edited all of the dialogue, locked it down, and then went into production. So shooting was a very interesting challenge. For those who don't know, there's this wonderful mod from a gentleman named McHorse called Blockbuster, and we used Blockbuster pretty heavily in the latter half of production on Edenith. But most of that production was a bit of a mix between Blockbuster and good old-fashioned body actors acting out scenes. However, in the years between Edenith and now, McHorse has made a slew of other mods and has essentially made a whole mod suite dedicated to making Machinima easier and expanding Machinima capabilities. So I actually had to do a bit of learning and a bit of homework because I wanted to use that suite with Blockbuster to get the most powerful setup possible. And I actually did a little bit of a test run, a little bit of a screen test where I shot like this bit of footage, edited it into a throwaway short, which I uploaded on social media as a test to sort of not only get back into machinimating, but also experiment with these new tools that weren't available the last time I'd machinimated in Minecraft. However, one major issue that came up was that these mods were only compatible up to 1.12.2 in terms of the Minecraft version, and the worlds that we had built some of the sets in were not actually of that version. They were of a later version, and we couldn't downgrade them to a previous version.
Fun fact, the actual set that was used in the final product was not the only version of the set that was built. That was a primarily finished version of the exterior set, but there was a later version that had more buildings and more scenery that unfortunately we couldn't use because it was in a later version of Minecraft, and that version did not have the interiors, and the interiors had to be rebuilt twice.
So we actually had to kind of reconstruct some of the sets, and Loryn did a phenomenal job as the production designer, making sure those got done and replicated in an earlier version world before we were able to finally shoot everything. So one of the advantages of having Blockbuster and McCourse's whole suite for this was having basically modular crowds, because there are a lot of characters on screen at any given point inside the courthouse. And basically that required a lot of front-end work of setting up those crowds so that they could be stationary for all the rest of the shots. And so I basically had to record sort of sitting poses for every individual in the crowd and every individual on the defense and prosecution table, and all of the villagers in the jury stand and the clerk and the judge. And I had to shoot basically idle animations for each of them. But then once I had those, the extras could be very modular, and I could turn off the ones I didn't need and turn on the ones I did need. And I had them connected to a system of multiple director blocks that were all connected to one another with redstone, and given commands such that I could play all of them and pause all of them at the same time. And basically I would use each of these director blocks as modular pieces of the set, where I could turn off the crowd or the jury or the legal teams or any given parts as I need them, or turn on certain elements, and so I could record each individual piece and then let it play out with the other elements in a sort of modular fashion. Now granted, this workflow wasn't all sunshine and roses. There were a lot of challenges that came with it, especially having to try and learn it on the fly. Even with all of the tests, there was still a lot of learning that was being done on set, and a lot of challenges and a lot of problems that cropped up sort of in the workflow, and I had to watch lots of tutorials to try and troubleshoot a lot of these issues. But the biggest challenge was definitely the head bobbing in sync with the pre-edited dialogue. That became a huge challenge. I ended up doing many takes just to try and get that syncing down right. And even then it wasn't perfect in the final result, but I wanted to make sure it was at least close enough that I could adjust it in post-production. I think it really is a huge part of the immersion, and it kind of takes you out of it when you see that head bobbing is kind of out of sync, especially since we had that pre-edited dialogue. I wanted to take that opportunity to make sure the sync was really dialed in and that the head bobbing was very much in line with the dialogue that you're hearing in your ears, so that what you hear and what you see kind of comes together in tandem, and there's just nothing taking you out of the immersion of the scene. And using Blockbuster and Aperture and all of that for the camera control was actually really useful. I got to do all sorts of things that I don't normally get to do when shooting in live action, such as motion control. So I was able to program camera paths and then repeat that so that I could get multiple layers of a composite that you can normally only get with expensive motion control rigs if you're to do them in live action. So then after production was wrapped, moved on to post-production. Now sound is actually one of the things that is very important to us. We kind of pride ourselves on having high attention to detail in sound editing and sound design and having a good balance. And so there was a lot of work that was actually put into the sound and the Foley work, a lot of original Foley elements we used for this, and all sorts of things like that to just give a sort of immersive soundscape. And then of course there was the color grading. I wanted to make sure the colors popped a little bit. Even though with shaders the gameplay does look a lot better than it does normally, but still I wanted that little bit of crispy pop to it. It was important to me to have a color palette that wasn't what you naturally see in Minecraft, so that you have more of that cinematic look. And there's a lot we do to sort of emulate the cinematic look, even though it's a machinima. For example, we shot this entire thing, much like Edenith, in the sort of anamorphic aspect ratio, so that you have that sort of widescreen crop. And little things like that, that basically communicate to the audience's mind that it's like, okay, this is a film you're watching, and not just a machinima, not just a Minecraft gameplay, but this is something that you can recognize as cinematic storytelling. And so post-production went on all the way up until the last minute. We set a release date, we released a trailer, that basically held us accountable to get it finished by then. But like I said, it went all the way up until the last minute, and even at the last minute, it wasn't even rendered until the day of, which I normally don't like to do, but yeah, I was working on it all up until then. And then on the last day, there were actually some rendering issues that were unforeseen that pushed it back a bit later into the day than I would have liked. Specifically, some of the scenes were deinterlaced accidentally, and so I had to re-render it all several times over before I got the problems entirely worked out. And even so, in the final product, as with any work of art, there are a lot of things I still would have liked to change and would have liked to work on, but ultimately, with the deadline coming up, eventually you gotta release it. And so despite all those mishaps, I think it was overall a pretty successful production, full of a whole lot of unique challenges, but overall I'm glad after all these years we finally picked it back up and got it finished.
So yeah, we had a poster for this. It was the first time we've ever had like a feature poster for any content we've done. And it was really nice. I got to put all the actors' names on it. I got to put like our production companies on there, and the character models that were in that were posed in Blender. Yeah, so I actually had to download somebody's Minecraft model rig and replace the skins with obviously all the characters. I posed those models, rendered it out in Blender, threw that into my graphic editing program, and pretty much arranged everything after that off of screenshots that Raph had sent me. Then I think I just took a screenshot of the set to kind of fill out the rest of the poster. The title was fun. I made the title too. To make that title, I also kind of looked at a bunch of like lawyer films, and I was like, all these lawyer films don't really have like any particular feel to them. Like I couldn't really get like a real good general aesthetic for like, I look at that, I see lawyers. So I was like, looking at all these things, I'm like, screw it, I'm just gonna do it on my own. I just threw some fonts together and did some graphic editing to it, and I was like, this turned out pretty well. I ended up just going with basic graphic principles of just a serif font, because serifs are kind of considered more professional. Sans serif, like Arial, is considered more casual. You write in sans serif, so you consider that pretty casual. You add a serif to the font and it becomes more professional. Like Times New Roman is like the basic like font you would type in. So I looked for a real strong serif font and kind of just arranged it such that it was titly and added some nice little designs to it.
So yeah, that's the story of the production of Trial of the Century. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I just want to say that we had a phenomenal cast for this short that I absolutely loved working with. It makes me so proud to look at the credits and see the names that we have on it. A lot of these are people that we have worked with before, as well as someone we're working with for the first time in the case of Scuffle. But in either case, I think the entire cast knocked it out of the ballpark, and this is particularly a dramatic short, and it's very performance heavy and very dialogue driven, and so it sort of lived or died on the performances. And it could have easily been not nearly as good as it was if the performances weren't there, if they weren't handling the dialogue correctly. And it feels like amongst our particular peer group, a bit of an ensemble cast. They absolutely nailed this sort of very specific tone and genre that I was going for that is very unusual for a Minecraft Machinima. Again, there was a lot I would have changed, a lot I would have liked to have more time to work on, but ultimately, as it was released, I think I'm pretty proud of the result. I think we achieved what we set out to do, and I'm glad after all these years in that sort of limbo that we finally got to pull this production out of the fire and bring it to its completion and release it to the world. So thank you all very much for watching, and if you haven't already seen Trial of the Century, I highly recommend you do so. Links for that will be all over the place. You'll be able to find it. God bless.